Normally, for my catching up on the classics videos, I like to talk about books that either I haven't read before or I haven't read in a long time, maybe since high school or college. But for this month, I'm kind of cheating a little bit. I read Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. This is actually my fourth time reading Les Mis, the whole thing unabridged, so it definitely is not new to me. But it's a classic that I really wanted to talk about, so let's talk about it. My first encounter with Les Mis was the 2012 movie version, the one with Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway, that one. And I loved it, and right away I decided that I wanted to read the book, which is not a small commitment. It's a big deal because this is the book. It's pretty big. It's depending on which version you get, which translation and page sizes and stuff like that. It's usually around 1,300 or 1,400 pages, so it's pretty long. And the first time that I read it, I did find it a little bit difficult to get into because the beginning part really doesn't have anything to do with the main story. It's the bishop. It's all about him and his life and how kind and generous he is, and just kind of setting up for his encounter with Jean Valjean, who's the main character of the book. Jean Valjean doesn't appear until maybe about 50 pages into it, depending on the version. So you have to get through a lot that's not really that plot relevant before you get to the story. And that's actually a trend in Les Mis. There are a lot of places where all of a sudden the story just gets dropped and the author starts talking about something that's more or less irrelevant to the actual plot. That's, I would say, one of the biggest drawbacks to reading Les Mis. The digressions can be very frustrating. But the story itself I find to be very compelling. I like the idea of, following Valjean through his life and the people that he encounters and the ways in which he touches their lives. It's a story that spans multiple decades from 1815 to 1833, and that's not counting things like the bishop's backstory, which goes all the way to before the French Revolution. There are a lot of characters, and it can be a lot to keep track of, but I've found that even some of the minor characters can be very memorable, and I don't have trouble keeping track of them anymore. And it's a story that addresses a lot of complex social issues that were relevant in the 19th century and in many cases are still relevant today. It's a story about a former criminal who has rehabilitated himself and is trying to live an honest life. It's a story about a single mother whose boyfriend abandoned her and their child and who's really struggling to support herself and to take care of the child. It's a story about a group of university students who see a lot of problems in the world and in their country and are trying to make a change. It's a story about poverty and destitution, about justice versus mercy, about democracy versus tyranny. Personally, I think that there's a lot to like in Les Mis. I would say, though, if you're interested in potentially reading Les Mis, I would recommend watching the musical first. Not necessarily the in-person musical on stage because, we're still in a pandemic and theater tickets can be expensive and there are all kinds of reasons why you might not want to or be able to do that. But you can get recordings of the 10th or 25th anniversary productions of the musical. You can get, obviously, the songs like through iTunes or Spotify or whatever. And then there's the 2012 movie musical. The reason that I recommend this is because I think that the musical is a pretty faithful adaptation of the book. It cuts some things, it changes some things, but most of the important events are still there, and the characters are still essentially who they are in the book in most cases. And so it's a good way to test out if you'll enjoy the story without committing to reading a 1,400-page book. It also, in my experience, can make it a little bit easier to get through the more tedious parts of the book. I don't know the first time that I read it, if I hadn't seen the musical, whether I would have made it through even the opening section of the book revolving around the bishop, let alone the parts taking place in the sewers of Paris or at the Battle of Waterloo. Those parts do tend to be very tedious and to drag on a little bit, and if you don't know where the story is headed or why it's relevant, I would imagine that it would be very difficult to stick it out. But if you've watched the musical, you have more of a general understanding of the plot and where it's headed, and so it can make those sections a little bit more palatable. A couple of things that you might be surprised by. First of all, there are a lot of different translations. Most works, when they get translated from their original language into another, there's usually only one translation. With Les Mis, there are several, and they're very different from each other. I'm actually planning on making a video about this later in the month, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But basically, you get your pick of whether you want very formal, antiquated 19th century style language or something more modernized, whether you want an almost literal word for word translation or more of a loose general translation. So it's really worth thinking about what you're looking for in the translation before you read Les Mis. And like I said, there will be a video about that later in the month. And like I said, there will be a video about that very soon. And once it's available, I will put a link to it right up there. So if you're interested in reading it, I would highly recommend checking that out or just Googling like different translations of Les Mis to find out what the differences are, because that will impact your reading experience. Another thing that you might be surprised by is that Les Mis doesn't actually take place during the French Revolution. That's a common misconception. It actually takes place in the 19th century. The French Revolution took place in the late 18th century. So while there is an insurrection in Paris in 1832 that a lot of the characters become involved in, it's not the French Revolution. There'll be a video later in the month talking about that as well. And then finally, one thing that you might be surprised by if you're only familiar with the musical and not with the book, is that there are several sequences that are taken out of the musical. Like, for instance, after the song Who Am I?, where Jean Valjean reveals his identity in order to prevent an innocent man from going to prison in his place. In the musical, he escapes, but in the book, he actually goes back to prison and then escapes from prison. There are several things like that where the musical cuts large segments of things that don't ultimately affect the long-term plot, but definitely happen differently in a more prolonged kind of way in the book. I know that some things that I've said in this video may seem very critical, like, oh, he goes on for so long about the sewers or whatever, but I do want to make it clear Les Mis is one of my favorite books of all time, and I have read it 4 times unabridged in the past 10 years. I wouldn't do that if I didn't love it. So I don't necessarily see it as like a book that everybody should read, because it definitely has its quirks, and it's a bit of an acquired taste, and it's a huge commitment to try and read it. But if you're at all interested in it, I do highly recommend at least watching the musical, seeing what it's about, maybe giving it a try, because it's a very insightful novel that has a lot to say and a lot to think about, and once you become emotionally invested in it, it's really fantastic.